Lyndon Baines Johnson, often referred to as LBJ, was an American politician who served as the 36th President of the United States from 1963 to 1969, assuming the office after serving as the 37th Vice President of the United States under President John F. Kennedy. From 1961 to 1963, Johnson was a Democrat from Texas, who served as a United States Representative from 1937 to 1949 and as a United States Senator from 1949 to 1961. He spent 6 years as Senate Majority Leader, 2 as Senate Minority Leader, and 2 as Senate Majority Whip. Johnson ran for the Democratic nomination in the 1960 presidential election. Although unsuccessful, he was chosen by Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts to be his running mate. They went on to win a close election over Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge. Johnson was sworn in as Vice President on January 20, 1961. 2 years and 10 months later, on November 22, 1963, Johnson succeeded Kennedy as president following the latter's assassination. He ran for a full term in the 1964 election, winning by a landslide over Republican opponent Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. He is one of only 4 people who have served as president, vice president, senator, and representative. Johnson was renowned for his domineering, sometimes abrasive, personality, and the Johnson treatment. His aggressive coercion of powerful politicians to advance legislation. Johnson designed the Great Society legislation upholding civil rights, public broadcasting, Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, the arts, urban and rural development, public services, and his war on poverty, assisted in part by a growing economy. The war on poverty helped millions of Americans rise above the poverty line during Johnson's presidency. Civil rights bills signed by Johnson banned racial discrimination in public facilities, interstate commerce, the workplace, and housing. And the Voting Rights Act banned certain requirements in southern states used to disenfranchise African Americans. With the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the country's immigration system was reformed and all racial origin quotas were removed, replaced by national origin quotas. Johnson escalated American involvement in the Vietnam War. In 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted Johnson the power to use military force in Southeast Asia without having to ask for an official declaration of war. The number of American military personnel in Vietnam increased dramatically, from 16,000 advisors in non-combat roles in 1963 to 550,000 in early 1968. Many in combat roles. American casualties soared and the peace process bogged down. Growing unease with the war stimulated a large, angry anti-war movement based especially on university campuses in the U.S. and abroad. Johnson faced further troubles when summer riots broke out in most major cities after 1965, and crime rates soared, as his opponents raised demands for law and order policies. While he began his presidency with widespread approval, support for Johnson declined as the public became upset with both the war and the growing violence at home. In 1968, the Democratic Party, factionalized as anti-war elements, denounced Johnson. He ended his bid for renomination after a disappointing finish in the New Hampshire primary. Republican Richard Nixon was elected to succeed him, as the New Deal coalition that had dominated presidential politics for 36 years collapsed. After he left office in January 1969, Johnson returned to his Texas ranch where he died of a heart attack at age 64 on January 22, 1973. Historians argue that Johnson's presidency marked the peak of modern liberalism in the United States after the New Deal era. Johnson is ranked favorably by some historians because of his domestic policies and the passage of many major laws affecting civil rights, gun control, wilderness preservation, and Social Security. Early years. Lyndon Baines Johnson was born on August 27, 1908, near Stonewall, Texas, in a small farmhouse on the Pedernales River. The oldest of 5 children born to Samuel Ely Johnson Jr. and Rebecca Baines. Johnson had one brother, Sam Houston Johnson, and 3 sisters, Rebecca, Josepha, and Lucia. The nearby small town of Johnson City, Texas, was named after LBJ's cousin, James Pope Johnson, whose forebears had moved west from Oglethorpe County, Georgia. Johnson had English, German, and Ulster Scots ancestry. Johnson's grandfather, Samuel Ely Johnson Sr., was raised as a Baptist, and for a time was a member of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. In his later years, the grandfather became a Christadelphian. Johnson's father also joined the Christadelphian Church toward the end of his life. In school, Johnson was an awkward, talkative youth and was elected president of his 11th grade class. He graduated from Johnson City High School, having participated in public speaking, debate, and baseball. In 1926, Johnson enrolled at SWTSTC, now Texas State University. He worked his way through school, participated in debate and campus politics, and edited the school newspaper, the College Star. I shall never forget the faces of the boys and the girls in that little Wellhausen Mexican school. And I remember even yet the pain of realizing and knowing then that college was closed to practically every one of those children because they were too poor. And I think it was then that I made up my mind that this nation could never rest while the door to knowledge remained closed to any American. Early political career. After teaching in Houston, Johnson entered politics. In 1930, he campaigned for Texas State Senator Willie Hopkins in his run for Congress. Hopkins recommended him to Congressman Richard M. Clayburgh, who made Johnson his legislative secretary. Johnson was elected Speaker of the Little Congress, a group of congressional aides, where he cultivated congressmen, newspapermen and lobbyists. Johnson's friends soon included aides to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, as well as fellow Texans such as Vice President John Nance Garner. He also became a surrogate son to Sam Rayburn, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Governor James Allred of Texas, and Johnson. 1937. Johnson later used an edited version of this photo, with Allred airbrushed out, in his 1941 senatorial campaign. Johnson married Claudia Alta Taylor, also known as Lady Bird, of Karnak, Texas on November 17, 1934, after he attended Georgetown University Law Center for several months. They had 2 daughters, Linda Bird, born in 1944, and Lucy Baines, born in 1947. Johnson gave his children names with the LBJ initials. His dog was Little Beagle Johnson. His was the LBJ Ranch. His initials were on his cufflinks, ashtrays, and clothes. In 1935, he was appointed head of the Texas National Youth Administration, which enabled him to use the government to create education and job opportunities for young people. He resigned 2 years later to run for Congress. Johnson, a notoriously tough boss throughout his career, often demanded long work days and work on weekends. U.S. congressional career. U.S. House of Representatives. In 1937, Johnson successfully campaigned in a special election for Texas's 10th congressional district that covered Austin and the surrounding hill country. He ran on a New Deal platform and was effectively aided by his wife. He served in the House from April 10, 1937, to January 3, 1949. In 1941, He ran for the Democratic U.S. Senate nomination in a special election. His main opponent was the sitting governor of Texas, businessman and radio personality W. Leo Daniel. Johnson narrowly lost the Democratic primary, which was then tantamount to election, with O'Daniel receiving 175,590 votes, and Johnson 174,279. U.S. Naval Reserve. Johnson was appointed a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve on June 21, 1940. While serving as a U.S. congressman, he was called to active duty 3 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. His orders were to report to the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, D.C., for instruction and training. Johnson reported to General Douglas MacArthur in Australia. Johnson and 2 U.S. Army officers went to the 22nd Bomb Group BAS, which was assigned the high-risk mission of bombing the Japanese airbase at Lae in New Guinea. Johnson's roommate was an Army second lieutenant who was a B-17 bomber pilot. On June 9, 1942, Johnson volunteered as an observer for an airstrike mission on New Guinea by 11 B-26 bombers. That included his roommate in another plane. While on the mission, his roommate and his crew's B-26 bomber was shot down, with none of the 8 men surviving the crash into the water. Reports vary on what happened to the B-26 bomber carrying Johnson during that mission. Johnson's biographer Robert Caro accepts Johnson's account and supports it with testimony from the aircrew concerned. The aircraft was attacked, disabling one engine, and it turned back before reaching its objective, though remaining under heavy fire. Others claim that it turned back because of generator trouble before reaching the objective and before encountering enemy aircraft, and never came under fire. This is said to be supported by official flight records. Johnson, who had used a camera as an observer. Johnson received the Silver Star, American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal for gallantry in action in the vicinity of Port Moresby and Salamala, New Guinea, on June 9, 1942. While on a mission of obtaining information in the Southwest Pacific area, Lieutenant Commander Johnson, in order to obtain personal knowledge of combat conditions, volunteered as an observer on a hazardous aerial combat mission over hostile positions in New Guinea. As our planes neared the target area, they were intercepted by 8 hostile fighters. When, at this time, the plane in which Lieutenant Commander Johnson was an observer developed mechanical trouble and was forced to turn back alone, presenting a favorable target to the enemy fighters. He evidenced marked coolness in spite of the hazards involved. His gallant actions enabled him to obtain and return with valuable information. U.S. Senate. Contested 1948 election. In the 1948 elections, Johnson again ran for the Senate and won in a highly controversial result in a 3-way Democratic Party primary. Johnson faced a well-known former governor, Coke Stevenson, and a third candidate. Johnson drew crowds to fairgrounds with his rented helicopter dubbed the Johnson City Windmill. He raised money to flood the state with campaign circulars and won over conservatives by voting for the Taft-Hartley Act, curbing union power, as well as by criticizing unions. Stevenson came in first but lacked a majority, so a runoff was held. Johnson campaigned even harder, while Stevenson's efforts slumped. The runoff count took a week, handled by the Democratic State Central Committee. Because this was a party primary, Johnson was finally announced the winner by 87 votes out of 988. 295 cast. The committee voted to certify Johnson's nomination by a majority of 1, with the last vote cast on Johnson's behalf by Temple, Texas, publisher Frank W. Mayborn. There were many allegations of voter fraud. One writer alleges that Johnson's campaign manager, future Texas Governor John B. Connally, was connected with 202 ballots in Precinct 13 in Jim Wells County where the names had curiously been listed in alphabetical order with the same pen and handwriting, just at the close of polling. Some of these voters insisted that they had not voted that day. Freshman senator to majority whip. Once in the Senate, Johnson was known among his colleagues for his highly successful courtships of older senators, especially Senator Richard Russell, Democrat from Georgia, the leader of the conservative coalition and arguably the most powerful man in the Senate. Johnson proceeded to gain Russell's favor in the same way that he had courted Speaker Sam Rayburn and gained his crucial support in the House. Johnson was appointed to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and later in 1950, he helped create the Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee. Johnson became its chairman and conducted investigations of defense costs and efficiency. These investigations revealed old investigations and demanded actions that were already being taken in part by the Truman administration. Although it can be said that the committee's investigations reinforced the need for changes, Johnson gained headlines and national attention through his handling of the press, the efficiency with which his committee issued new reports, and the fact that he ensured that every report was endorsed unanimously by the committee. Johnson used his political influence in the Senate to receive broadcast licenses from the Federal Communications Commission in his wife's name. Senate Democratic leader. In the 1952 general election, Republicans won a majority in both the House and Senate. Among defeated Democrats that year was McFarland, who lost to upstart Barry Goldwater. In January 1953, Johnson was chosen by his fellow Democrats to be the minority leader. He became the most junior senator ever elected to this position. One of his first actions was to eliminate the seniority system in making appointments to committees, while retaining it for chairmanships. In the 1954 election, Johnson was re-elected to the Senate, and since the Democrats won the majority in the Senate, Johnson then became Majority Leader. Former Majority Leader William Nolan became Minority Leader. Johnson's duties were to schedule legislation and help pass measures favored by the Democrats. Johnson, Rayburn and President Dwight D. Eisenhower worked well together in passing Eisenhower's domestic and foreign agenda. During the Suez Crisis, Johnson tried to prevent the U.S. government from criticizing the Israeli invasion of the Sinai Peninsula, along with the rest of the nation. Johnson was appalled by the threat of possible Soviet domination of space flight implied by the launch of the first artificial Earth satellite Sputnik 1, and used his influence to ensure passage of the 1958 National Aeronautics and Space Act, which established the civilian space agency NASA. The treatment could last 10 minutes or 4 hours. It came, enveloping its target, at the Johnson Ranch swimming pool, in one of Johnson's offices, in the Senate cloakroom, on the floor of the Senate itself, wherever Johnson might find a fellow senator within his reach. Its tone could be supplication, accusation, cajolery, exuberance, scorn, tears, complaint, and the hint of threat. It was all of these together. It ran the gamut of human emotions. Its velocity was breathtaking, and it was all in one direction. Interjections from the target were rare. Johnson anticipated them before they could be spoken. He moved in close, his face a scant millimeter from his target, his eyes widening and narrowing, his eyebrows rising and falling. From his pockets poured clippings, memos, statistics, mimicry, humor, and the genius of analogy made the treatment an almost hypnotic experience and rendered the target stunned and helpless. A 60-cigarette-per-day smoker, Johnson suffered a near-fatal heart attack on July 2, 1955. He abruptly gave up smoking as a result, with only a couple of exceptions, and did not resume the habit until he left the White House on January 20, 1969. Vice Presidency nomination. Johnson's success in the Senate rendered him a potential Democratic presidential candidate. He had been the favorite son candidate of the Texas delegation at the party's national convention in 1956, and appeared to be in a strong position to run for the 1960 nomination. Jim Rowe repeatedly urged Johnson to launch a campaign in early 1959, but Johnson thought it better to wait, thinking that John Kennedy's efforts would create a division in the ranks which could then be exploited. Rowe finally joined the Humphrey campaign in frustration, another move which Johnson thought played into his own strategy. Johnson attempted in vain to capitalize on Kennedy's youth, poor health, and failure to take a position regarding Joseph McCarthy. According to Kennedy's special counsel Maya Feldman and to Kennedy himself, it is impossible to reconstruct the precise manner in which Johnson's vice presidential nomination ultimately took place. Kennedy did realize that he could not be elected without support of traditional Southern Democrats, most of whom had backed Johnson. Nevertheless, labor leaders were unanimous in their opposition to Johnson. After much back and forth with party leaders and others on the matter, Kennedy did offer Johnson the vice presidential nomination at the Los Angeles Biltmore Hotel at 10:15 a.m. on July 14, the morning after he was nominated, and Johnson accepted. From that point to the actual nomination that evening, the facts are in dispute in many respects. Convention Chairman Leroy Collins' declaration of a two-thirds majority in favor by voice vote is even disputed. Seymour Hersh stated that Robert F. Kennedy, known as Bobby, hated Johnson for his attacks on the Kennedy family, and later maintained that his brother offered the position to Johnson merely as a courtesy, expecting him to decline. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. concurred with Robert Kennedy's version of events, and put forth that John Kennedy would have preferred Stuart Symington as his running mate, alleging that Johnson teamed with House Speaker Sam Rayburn and pressured Kennedy to favor Johnson. Biographer Robert Caro offered a different perspective. He wrote that the Kennedy campaign was desperate to win what was forecast to be a very close election against Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Johnson was needed on the ticket to help carry Texas and the southern states. Caro's research showed that on July 14, John Kennedy started the process while Johnson was still asleep. At 6:30 a.m., John Kennedy asked Robert Kennedy to prepare an estimate of upcoming electoral votes, including Texas. Caro continues in his analysis that Robert Kennedy tried to get Johnson to agree to be the Democratic Party chairman rather than vice president. Johnson refused to accept a change in plans unless it came directly from John Kennedy. Despite his brother's interference, John Kennedy was firm that Johnson was who he wanted as running mate. He met with staffers such as Larry O'Brien, his national campaign manager, to say that Johnson was to be vice president. O'Brien recalled later that John Kennedy's words were wholly unexpected, but that after a brief consideration of the electoral vote situation, he thought it was a stroke of genius. At the same time as his vice presidential run, Johnson also sought a third term in the U.S. Senate. According to Robert Caro, on November 8, 1960, Lyndon Johnson won election for both the vice presidency of the United States, on the Kennedy-Johnson ticket, and for a third term as senator. He had Texas law changed to allow him to run for both offices. When he won the vice presidency, he made arrangements to resign from the Senate, as he was required to do under federal law, as soon as it convened on January 3, 1961. Quote, in 1988, Lloyd Benson, the vice presidential running mate of Democratic presidential candidate Michael Dukakis, and also a senator from Texas, took advantage of Lyndon's law, and was able to retain his seat in the Senate despite Dukakis' loss to George H. W. Bush. Johnson was re-elected senator with 306,605 votes to Republican John Towers' 927,653. Fellow Democrat William A. Blackley was appointed to replace Johnson as senator, but Blackley lost a special election in May 1961 to Tower office. After the election, Johnson was quite concerned about the traditionally ineffective nature of his new office, and set about to assume authority not allotted to the position. He initially sought a transfer of the authority of Senate Majority Leader to the Vice Presidency, since that office made him President of the Senate, but faced vehement opposition from the Democratic caucus, including members whom he had counted as his supporters. Johnson sought to increase his influence within the executive branch. He drafted an executive order for Kennedy's signature, granting Johnson general supervision over matters of national security, and requiring all government agencies to cooperate fully with the vice president in the carrying out of these assignments. Kennedy's response was to sign a non-binding letter requesting Johnson to review national security policies instead. His lack of influence was thrown into relief later in 1961 when Kennedy appointed Johnson's friend, Sarah T. Hughes, to a federal judgeship, whereas Johnson had tried and failed to garner the nomination for Hughes at the beginning of his vice presidency. House Speaker Sam Rayburn wrangled the appointment from Kennedy in exchange for support of an administration bill. Moreover, many members of the Kennedy White House were contemptuous of Johnson, including the president's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, and they ridiculed his comparatively brusque, crude manner. Congressman Tip O'Neill recalled that the Kennedy men had a disdain for Johnson that they didn't even try to hide. They actually took pride in snubbing him. Quote, opening day of 1961 baseball season. President Kennedy throws out the first ball at Griffith Stadium, the home field of the Washington Senators, as LBJ and Hubert Humphrey look on. Kennedy, however, made efforts to keep Johnson busy, informed, and at the White House often telling aides, "I can't afford to have my vice president, who knows every reporter in Washington, going around saying we're all screwed up, so we're going to keep him happy." Kennedy appointed him to jobs such as head of the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunities, through which he worked with African Americans and other minorities. Kennedy may have intended this to remain a more nominal position, but Taylor Branch in Pillar of Fire contends that Johnson pushed the Kennedy administration's actions further and faster for civil rights than Kennedy originally intended to go. Branch notes the irony of Johnson being the advocate for civil rights, when the Kennedy family had hoped that he would appeal to conservative Southern voters. In particular, he notes Johnson's Memorial Day 1963 speech at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania as being a catalyst that led to more action. Johnson took on numerous minor diplomatic missions, which gave him limited insights into global issues, as well as opportunities at self-promotion in the name of showing the country's flag. He attended Cabinet and National Security Council meetings. Kennedy gave Johnson control over all presidential appointments involving Texas, and appointed him chairman of the President's Ad Hoc Committee for Science. Kennedy also appointed Johnson chairman of the National Aeronautics Space Council. The Soviets beat the U.S. with the first manned spaceflight in April 1961, and Kennedy gave Johnson the task of evaluating the state of the U.S. space program and recommending a project that would allow the U.S. to catch up or beat the Soviets. Johnson was touched by a Senate scandal in August 1963 when Bobby Baker, the secretary to the Majority Leader of the Senate and a protege of Johnson's, came under investigation by the Senate Rules Committee for allegations of bribery and financial malfeasance. One witness alleged that Baker had arranged for the witness to give kickbacks for the vice president. Baker resigned in October, and the investigation did not expand to Johnson. The negative publicity from the affair fed rumors in Washington circles that Kennedy was planning on dropping Johnson from the Democratic ticket in the upcoming 1964 presidential election. However, on October 31, 1963, a reporter asked if he intended and expected to have Johnson on the ticket the following year. Kennedy replied, "Yes to both those questions." Quote, Presidency. Johnson's presidency took place during a healthy economy, with steady growth and low unemployment. Regarding the rest of the world, there were no serious controversies with major countries. Attention therefore focused on domestic policy, and, after 1966, on the Vietnam War. Succession. Johnson was quickly sworn in as president on the Air Force One plane in Dallas on November 22, 1963, just 2 hours and 8 minutes after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Amid suspicions of a conspiracy against the government, he was convinced of the need to make an immediate transition of power after the assassination to provide stability to a grieving nation in shock. He and the Secret Service were concerned that he could also be a target of a conspiracy, and felt compelled to rapidly remove the new president from Dallas and return him to Washington. This was greeted by some with assertions that Johnson was in too much haste to assume power. In the days following the assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson made an address to Congress saying that no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. The wave of national grief following the assassination gave enormous momentum to Johnson's promise to carry out Kennedy's plans and his policy of seizing Kennedy's legacy to give momentum to his legislative agenda. On November 29, 1963, just 1 week after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson issued an executive order to rename NASA's Apollo Launch Operations Center and the NASA Air Force Cape Canaveral launch facilities as the John F. Kennedy Space Center. Johnson was alert to the public demand for answers. To head off snowballing speculation about such conspiracies, he immediately created a panel headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren, known as the Warren Commission, to investigate Kennedy's assassination. Johnson retained senior Kennedy appointees, some for the full term of his presidency. He even retained Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, with whom he had a notoriously difficult relationship. Robert Kennedy remained in office for a few months until leaving in 1964 to run for the Senate. Rapid legislative initiatives. The new president thought it advantageous to quickly pursue one of Kennedy's primary legislative goals, a tax cut. Johnson worked closely with Harry F. Byrd of Virginia to negotiate a reduction in the budget below $100 billion in exchange for what became overwhelming Senate approval of the Revenue Act of 1964. Congressional approval followed at the end of February, and facilitated efforts to follow on civil rights. Civil rights. Meeting with civil rights leaders Rev. Martin Luther King Jr., Left. Whitney Young, and James Farmer in the Oval Office in 1964. President Kennedy had submitted a civil rights bill to Congress in June 1963, which was met with strong opposition. Johnson was quite familiar with the procedural tactic, as he played a role in a similar tactic against the civil rights bill that Harry Truman had submitted to Congress 15 years earlier. Passing the civil rights bill in the House required getting it through the Rules Committee, which had been holding it up in an attempt to kill it. Johnson decided on a campaign to use a discharge petition to force it onto the House floor. LBJ repped white America in a moral straitjacket. How could individuals who fervently, continuously, and overwhelmingly identified themselves with a merciful and just God continue to condone racial discrimination, police brutality, and segregation, wherein the Judeo-Christian ethic was their justification for killing young girls in a church in Alabama, denying an equal education to black children, barring fathers and mothers from competing for jobs that would feed and clothe their families? Was Jim Crow to be America's response to godless communism? Wood states that Johnson's religiosity ran deep. At 15 he joined the Disciples of Christ, or Christian, church, and would forever believe that it was the duty of the rich to care for the poor, the strong to assist the weak, and the educated to speak for the inarticulate. Quote, "The Great Society." Johnson wanted a catchy slogan for the 1964 campaign to describe his proposed domestic agenda for 1965. Eric Goldman, who joined the White House in December of that year, thought Johnson's domestic program was best captured in the title of Walter Lippmann's book, The Good Society. Richard Goodwin tweaked it to The Great Society, and incorporated this in detail as part of a speech for Johnson in May 1964 at the University of Michigan. It encompassed movements of urban renewal, modern transportation, clean environment, anti-poverty, healthcare reform, crime control, and educational reform. Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In August 1964, allegations arose from the military that 2 U.S. destroyers had been attacked by some North Vietnamese torpedo boats in international waters 40 miles from the Vietnamese coast in the Gulf of Tonkin. Naval communications and reports of the attack were contradictory. Although Johnson very much wanted to keep discussions about Vietnam out of the 1964 election campaign, he felt forced to respond to the supposed aggression by the Vietnamese. So he sought and obtained from the Congress the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7. Johnson, determined to embolden his image on foreign policy, also wanted to prevent criticism such as Truman had received in Korea by proceeding without congressional endorsement of military action. A response to the purported attack as well blunted presidential campaign criticism of weakness from the hawkish Goldwater camp. The resolution gave congressional approval for use of military force by the commander-in-chief to repel future attacks and also to assist members of SEATO requesting assistance. Johnson later in the campaign expressed assurance that the primary U.S. goal remained the preservation of South Vietnamese independence through material and advice, as opposed to any U.S. offensive posture. 1964 presidential election. In spring 1964, Johnson did not look optimistically upon the prospect of being elected president in his own right. That same year, Robert F. Kennedy was widely considered an impeccable choice to run as Johnson's vice presidential running mate, but Johnson and Kennedy, however, had never liked one another, and Johnson, afraid that Kennedy would be credited with his election as president, abhorred the idea and opposed it at every turn. In preparation for the Democratic convention, Johnson requested the FBI send a squad of 30 agents to cover convention activities. The objective of the squad was to inform the White House staff of any disruptive activities on the floor. The squad's focus narrowed upon the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party (MFDP) delegation, which sought to displace the white segregationist delegation regularly selected in the state. The squad's activities also included wiretaps of Martin Luther King's room as well as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee (SNCC), and the Congress of Racial Equality (CORE). From beginning to end, the squad's assignment was carefully couched in terms of the monitoring of disruptive activities that might endanger the president and other high-ranking officials. In fact, Johnson was very concerned about potential political damage from media coverage of racial tensions exposed by a credentials fight between the MFDP and the segregationist delegation, and he assigned Humphrey the job of managing the problem. Early in the 1964 presidential campaign, Barry Goldwater appeared to be a strong contender, with strong support from the South, which threatened Johnson's position as he had predicted in reaction to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. However, Goldwater lost momentum as his campaign progressed. On September 7, 1964, Johnson's campaign managers broadcast the Daisy ad. It portrayed a little girl picking petals from a daisy, counting up to 10. Then a baritone voice took over, counted down from 10 to 0, and the visual showed the explosion of a nuclear bomb. The message conveyed was that electing Goldwater president held the danger of a nuclear war. Goldwater's campaign message was best symbolized by the bumper sticker displayed by supporters, claiming, "In your heart, you know he's right." Quote, opponents captured the spirit of Johnson's campaign with bumper stickers that said, "In your heart, you know he might," and "In your gut, you know he's nuts." Voting Rights Act. Johnson began his elected presidential term with similar motives as he had upon succeeding to the office, ready to carry forward the plans and programs of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, not because of our sorrow or sympathy, but because they are right. Quote, Johnson gave a congressional speech. Dallas considers it his greatest, in which he said, "Rarely at any time does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself. Rarely are we met with the challenge, to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our beloved nation. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue. And should we defeat every enemy, should we double our wealth and conquer the stars, and still be unequal to this issue, then we will have failed as a people and as a nation." Quote, President Lyndon B. Johnson, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks at the signing of the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965. After the murder of civil rights worker Viola Liuzzo, Johnson went on television to announce the arrest of 4 Ku Klux Klansmen implicated in her death. He angrily denounced the Klan as a hooded society of bigots, and warned them to return to a decent society before it's too late. Johnson was the first president to arrest and prosecute members of the Klan since Ulysses S. Grant about 93 years earlier. In 1967, Johnson nominated civil rights attorney Thurgood Marshall to be the first African-American Associate Justice of the Supreme Court to head the new Department of Housing and Urban Development. Johnson appointed Robert C. Weaver, the first African-American cabinet secretary in any U.S. presidential administration. In 1968, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which provided for equal housing opportunities regardless of race, creed, or national origin. The impetus for the law's passage came from the 1966 Chicago open housing movement, the April 4, 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr., and the civil unrest across the country following King's death. Immigration. President Johnson signs the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 as Sen. Edward Kennedy, Sen. Robert Kennedy, and others look on. With the passage of the sweeping Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the country's immigration system was reformed and all national origins quotas dating from the 1920s were removed. The annual rate of inflow doubled between 1965 and 1970, and doubled again by 1990, with dramatic increases from Asia and Mexico. Federal funding for education. Johnson, whose own ticket out of poverty was a public education in Texas, fervently believed that education was a cure for ignorance and poverty, and was an essential component of the American dream. especially for minorities who endured poor facilities and tight-fisted budgets from local taxes. For the first time, large amounts of federal money went to public schools. In practice, ESEA meant helping all public school districts, with more money going to districts that had large proportions of students from poor families, which included all the big cities. For the first time, private schools, most of them Catholic schools in the inner cities, received services, such as library funding, comprising about 12% of the ESEA budget. Though federal funds were involved, they were administered by local officials, and by 1977 it was reported that less than half of the funds were actually applied toward the education of children under the poverty line. Dalek further reports that researchers cited by Hugh Davis Graham soon found that poverty had more to do with family background and neighborhood conditions than the quantity of education a child received. Early studies suggested initial improvements for poor children helped by ESEA reading and math programs, but later assessments indicated that benefits faded quickly and left pupils little better off than those not in the schemes. Johnson's second major education program was the Higher Education Act of 1965, which focused on funding for lower-income students, including grants, work-study money, and government loans. Although ESEA solidified Johnson's support among K-12 teachers' unions, neither the Higher Education Act nor the new endowments mollified the college professors and students growing increasingly uneasy with the war in Vietnam. In 1967, Johnson signed the Public Broadcasting Act to create educational television programs to supplement the broadcast networks. In 1965, Johnson also set up the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts to support academic subjects such as literature, history, and law, and arts such as music, painting, and sculpture, as the WPA once did. War on Poverty and Healthcare Reform. Former President Truman and wife Bessie Medicare bill signing in 1965, as Lady Bird and Hubert Humphrey look on. In 1964, at Johnson's request, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1964 and the Economic Opportunity Act. As part of the War on Poverty, Johnson set in motion legislation creating programs such as Head Start, food stamps and work-study. Johnson took an additional step in the War on Poverty with an urban renewal effort, presenting to Congress in January 1966 the Demonstration Cities program. To be eligible, a city would need to demonstrate its readiness to arrest blight and decay and make substantial impact on the development of its entire city. Johnson requested an investment of $400 million per year, totaling $2.4 billion. In the fall of 1966, the Congress passed a substantially reduced program costing $900 million, which Johnson later called the Model Cities Program. Changing the name had little effect on the success of the bill. The New York Times wrote 22 years later that the program was for the most part a failure. Johnson's initial effort to improve health care was the creation of the Commission on Heart Disease, Cancer and Strokes, HDCS. Combined, these diseases accounted for 71% of the nation's deaths in 1962. To enact recommendations of the commission, Johnson asked Congress for funds to set up the Regional Medical Program, RMP, to create a network of hospitals with federally funded research and practice. Congress passed a significantly watered-down version. As a backup position, in 1965 Johnson turned his focus to hospital insurance for the aged under Social Security. Transportation. In March 1965, Johnson sent to Congress a transportation message which included the creation of a new transportation department, which would include the Commerce Department's Office of Transportation, the Bureau of Public Roads, the Federal Aviation Agency, the Coast Guard, the Maritime Administration, the Civil Aeronautics Board and the Interstate Commerce Commission. The bill passed the Senate after some negotiation over navigation projects. In the House, passage required negotiation over maritime interests and the bill was signed October 15, 1965. Gun control and the space program. On October 22, 1968, Lyndon Johnson signed the Gun Control Act of 1968, one of the largest and farthest-reaching federal gun control laws in American history. Much of the motivation for this large expansion of federal gun regulations came as a response to the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. During Johnson's administration, NASA conducted the Gemini manned space program, developed the Saturn V rocket and its launch facility, and prepared to make the first manned Apollo program flights. On January 27, 1967, the nation was stunned when the entire crew of Apollo 1 was killed in a cabin fire during a spacecraft test on the launch pad, stopping Apollo in its tracks. Rather than appointing another Warren-style commission, Johnson accepted Administrator James E. Webb's request for NASA to do its own investigation, holding itself accountable to Congress and the President. On July 16, 1969, Johnson attended the launch of the first moon landing mission Apollo 11, becoming the first former or incumbent U.S. president to witness a rocket launch. Urban riots. Major riots in black neighborhoods caused a series of long hot summers. Quote, they started with a violent disturbance in the Harlem riots in 1964, and the Watts district of Los Angeles in 1965, and extended to 1971. The momentum for the advancement of civil rights came to a sudden halt in the summer of 1965, with the rise in Watts. After 34 people were killed and $35 million in property was damaged, the public feared an expansion of the violence to other cities, and so the appetite for additional programs in LBJ's agenda was lost. Newark burned in 1967, where 6 days of rioting left 26 dead, 1,500 injured, and the inner city a burned-out shell. In Detroit in 1967, Governor George Romney sent in 7,400 National Guard troops to quell fire bombings, looting, and attacks on businesses and on police. Johnson finally sent in federal troops with tanks and machine guns. Detroit continued to burn for 3 more days until finally 43 were dead, 2,250 were injured, 4,000 were arrested. Property damage ranged into the hundreds of millions. The biggest wave of riots came in April 1968 in over 100 cities after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Johnson called for even more billions to be spent in the cities and another federal civil rights law regarding housing, but this fell on deaf ears. Johnson's popularity plummeted as a massive white political backlash took shape, reinforcing the sense Johnson had lost control of the streets of major cities as well as his party. Backlash against Johnson, 1966-67. In 1966, the press sensed a credibility gap between what Johnson was saying in press conferences and what was happening on the ground in Vietnam, which led to much less favorable coverage. By year's end, the Democratic governor of Missouri, Warren E. Hearns, warned that Johnson would lose the state by 100,000 votes, despite winning by a 500,000 margin in 1964. Frustration over Vietnam, too much federal spending and taxation, no great public support for your Great Society programs, and public disenchantment with the civil rights programs had eroded the president's standing. The governor reported, there were bright spots. In January 1967, Johnson boasted that wages were the highest in history. Unemployment was at a 13-year low. and corporate profits and farm incomes were greater than ever. A 4.5% jump in consumer prices was worrisome, as was the rise in interest rates. Johnson asked for a temporary 6% surcharge in income taxes to cover the mounting deficit caused by increased spending. Johnson's approval ratings stayed below 50%. By January 1967, the number of his strong supporters had plunged to 16%, from 25% 4 months before. He ran about even with Republican George Romney in trial matchups that spring. Asked to explain why he was unpopular, Johnson responded, "I am a dominating personality, and when I get things done I don't always please all the people." Johnson also blamed the press, saying they showed complete irresponsibility and lie and misstate facts and have no one to be answerable to. Quote, he also blamed the preachers, liberals and professors, who had turned against him. Vietnam War 1964. Johnson subscribed to the domino theory in Vietnam and to a containment policy that required America to make a serious effort to stop all communist expansion. He expanded the numbers and roles of the American military following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, soon after the Republican Convention of 1964. Johnson in late summer 1964 seriously questioned the value of staying in Vietnam, but, after meeting with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Maxwell D. Taylor, declared his readiness to do more when we had a base, or when Saigon was politically more stable. In the winter of 1964-65, Johnson was pressured by the military to begin a bombing campaign to forcefully resist a communist takeover in South Vietnam. Moreover, a plurality in the polls at the time were in favor of military action against the communists, with only 26 to 30% opposed. 1965. Johnson decided on a systematic bombing campaign in February after a ground report from Bundy, recommending immediate U.S. action to avoid defeat. Also, the Viet Cong had just killed 8 U.S. advisors and wounded dozens of others in an attack at Pleiku Air Base. The 8-week bombing campaign became known as Operation Rolling Thunder. Johnson's instructions for public consumption were clear. There was to be no comment that the war effort had been expanded. In March, Bundy began to urge the use of ground forces. American air operations alone, he counseled, would not stop Hanoi's aggression against the South. Johnson approved an increase in logistical troops of 18,000 to 20,000, the deployment of 2 additional Marine battalions and a Marine Air Squadron, in addition to planning for the deployment of 2 more divisions, and most importantly a change in mission from defensive to offensive operations. Nevertheless, he disobligingly continued to insist that this was not to be publicly represented as a change in existing policy. In early 1965, Johnson sent U.S. Marines to the Dominican Republic to protect the embassy there and to respond to yet another perceived communist threat by the escalating Civil War. That spring an agreement was reached at the urging of the OAS and the U.S. to end the uprising. This crisis reinforced Johnson's belief it was essential to convince supporters and opponents at home and abroad that he had an effective strategy to meet the communist challenge in Vietnam. After a conference of advisors in Honolulu in April 1965, by the middle of June the total U.S. ground forces in Vietnam were increased to 82,000, or by 150%. Philippines President Marcos hosting the leaders of SEATO nations during the Manila Conference on the Vietnam War. Polls showed that beginning in 1965, the public was consistently 40-50% hawkish and 10-25% dovish. Johnson's aides told him, both hawks and doves politically. Johnson closely watched the public opinion polls. His goal was not to adjust his policies to follow opinion, but rather to adjust opinion to support his policies. Until the Tet Offensive of 1968, he systematically downplayed the war. He made very few speeches about Vietnam, and held no rallies or parades or advertising campaigns. He feared that publicity would charge up the hawks who wanted victory, and weaken both his containment policy and his higher priorities in domestic issues. Jacobs and Shapiro conclude, although Johnson held a core of support for his position, the president was unable to move Americans who held hawkish and dovish positions. Quote, on April 2, 1965, the current Canadian Prime Minister, Lester B. Pearson, gave a speech at Temple University in Philadelphia. During his speech, he voiced his support for a pause in the American bombing of North Vietnam, so that a diplomatic solution to the crisis may unfold. To President Johnson, this criticism of American foreign policy on American soil was an intolerable sin. Before Pearson had finished his speech, he was summoned to Camp David, Maryland, to meet with Johnson the next day. Johnson, who was notorious for his personal touch in politics, reportedly grabbed Pearson by the lapels and shouted, "Don't you come into my living room and piss on my rug." Quote, 1966. At the end of 1965, after consultation with the Joint Chiefs and other advisors, Johnson decided to increase troops at the rate of 15,000 per month throughout 1966 rather than increasing them at one time, in order to avoid a more publicized increase. At the same time, there was deliberation over a bombing pause, and Johnson finally agreed on December 28 to a pause and a corresponding peace offensive. The pause in bombing and the peace blitz ended January 31 without discernible effect, disturbed by criticism of the war, then underscored with public hearings by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in January. Johnson convened a second Honolulu conference, and personally attended for 3 days along with Ambassador Lodge, Gen. Westmoreland, the Vietnamese Chief of State Nguyen Van Thu, and Prime Minister Win Sao. Kentucky. Public as well as political impatience with the war began to emerge in the spring of 1966. At the time, when Johnson's approval ratings were reaching new lows of 41%, Sen. Richard Russell, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, reflected the national mood in June 1966, when he declared it was time to get it over or get out. In the fall of 1966, however, multiple sources began to report progress was being made against the North Vietnamese logistics and infrastructure. Johnson was urged from every corner to begin peace discussions. There was no shortage of peace initiatives. Nevertheless, among protesters, English philosopher Bertrand Russell attacked Johnson's policy as a barbaric, aggressive war of conquest, and in June he initiated the International War Crimes Tribunal as a means to condemn the American effort. By year's end, it was clear that current pacification efforts were ineffectual, as had been the air campaign. Johnson then agreed to McNamara's new recommendation to add 70,000 troops in 1967 to the 400,000 previously committed. While McNamara recommended no increase in the level of bombing, Johnson agreed with CIA recommendations to increase them. 1967. January and February 1967 included probes to detect North Vietnamese willingness to discuss peace, and all fell on deaf ears. Ho Chi Minh declared that the only solution was a unilateral withdrawal by the U.S. In March, Robert Kennedy assumed a more public opposition to the war in the Senate speech. The fact of his opposition and probable candidacy for the presidency in 1968, according to Dalek, inhibited the embattled and embittered Johnson from employing a more realistic war policy. By the middle of 1967, nearly 70,000 Americans had been killed or wounded in the war. In July, Johnson sent McNamara Wheeler and other officials to meet with Westmoreland and reach agreement on plans for the immediate future. At that time, the war was being commonly described by the press and others as a stalemate. Westmoreland said such a description was pure fiction, and that, "we are winning slowly but steadily and the pace can excel if we reinforce our successes." Washington, D.C. In October 1967. Support for the Vietnam War was dropping and the anti-Vietnam War movement strengthened. In August, Johnson, with the Joint Chiefs' support, decided to expand the air campaign and exempted only Hanoi, Haiphong and a buffer zone with China from the target list. Despite the election, the South Vietnam government remained incompetent and riddled with corruption. But, in September, Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnamese Premier Pham Van Dong appeared amenable to French mediation, so Johnson ceased bombing in a 10-mile zone around Hanoi. This was met with dissatisfaction. Johnson in a Texas speech agreed to halt all bombing if Ho Chi Minh would launch productive and meaningful discussions and if North Vietnam would not seek to take advantage of the halt. This was named the San Antonio Formula. There was no response, but Johnson pursued the possibility of negotiations with such bombing pause. Fellow Democrat Tip O'Neill joined the ranks of those opposed to the war in late 1967, and with the ever-increasing public protests against the war. In October, Johnson engaged the FBI and the CIA to investigate, monitor and undermine anti-war activists. With the war still arguably in a stalemate and in light of the widespread disapproval of the conflict, Johnson convened a group called the Wise Men for a fresh, in-depth look at the war. Dean Acheson, Gen. Omar Bradley, George Ball, Mac Bundy, Arthur Dean, Douglas Dillon, Abe Fortas, Averell Harriman, Henry Cabot Lodge, Robert Murphy and Max Taylor. On June 23, 1967, Johnson traveled to Los Angeles for a Democratic fundraiser. Thousands of anti-war protesters tried to march past the hotel where he was speaking. The march was led by a coalition of peace protesters. However, a small group of Progressive Labor Party and SDS protesters activists placed themselves at the head of the march and, when they reached the hotel, staged a sit-down. Efforts by march monitors to keep the main body of the marchers moving were only partially successful. Hundreds of LAPD officers were massed at the hotel, and when the march slowed, an order was given to disperse the crowd. The riot act was read and 51 protesters arrested. 1968. As casualties mounted and success seemed further away than ever, Johnson's popularity plummeted. College students and others protested, burned draft cards, and chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Quote. On January 30th came the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Tet offensive against South Vietnam's 5 largest cities, including Saigon and the U.S. Embassy there and other government installations. While the Tet offensive failed militarily, it was a psychological victory, definitively turning American public opinion against the war effort. Iconically, Walter Cronkite of CBS News, voted the nation's most trusted person, in February expressed on the air that the conflict was deadlocked and that additional fighting would change nothing. Johnson reacted, saying, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Tens of thousands of civilians were killed during the American bombing of North Vietnam in Operation Rolling Thunder. In March, Johnson decided to restrict future bombing, with the result that 90% of North Vietnam's population and 75% of its territory was off-limits to bombing. In April, he succeeded in opening discussions of peace talks, and after extensive negotiations over the site, Paris was agreed to, and talks began in May. When the talks failed to yield any results, the decision was made to resort to private discussions. In Paris, A few analysts have theorized that Vietnam had no independent impact on President Johnson's popularity at all after other effects, including a general overall downward trend in popularity, had been taken into account. The war grew less popular and continued to split the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was not completely pro or anti-war, and Nixon managed to get support from both groups by running on a reduction in troop levels with an eye toward eventually ending the campaign. Johnson often privately cursed the Vietnam War and, in a conversation with Robert McNamara, he assailed the bunch of commies running the New York Times for their articles against the war effort. "I knew from the start that I was bound to be crucified either way I moved. If I left the woman I really loved, the Great Society, in order to get involved in that bitch of a war on the other side of the world, then I would lose everything at home, all my programs. But if I left that war and let the communists take over South Vietnam, then I would be seen as a coward and my nation would be seen as an appeaser and we would both find it impossible to accomplish anything for anybody anywhere on the entire globe." Biographers including Dalek have said that Johnson suffered agonizing decisions in the Vietnam War and felt it caused divisions both in the U.S. and abroad. Johnson was afraid that, if he tried to defeat the North Vietnamese regime with an invasion of North Vietnam, rather than simply try to protect South Vietnam, he might provoke the Chinese to stage a full-scale military intervention similar to their intervention in 1950 during the Korean War, as well as provoke the Soviets into launching a full-scale military invasion of Western Europe. The Six-Day War and Israel. In a 1993 interview for the Johnson Presidential Library Oral History Archives, Johnson's Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stated that a carrier battle group, the U.S. Sixth Fleet, sent on a training exercise toward Gibraltar was repositioned back towards the eastern Mediterranean to be able to assist Israel during the Six-Day War of June 1967. Given the rapid Israeli advances following their strike on Egypt, the administration thought the situation was so tense in Israel that perhaps the Syrians, fearing Israel would attack them, or the Soviets supporting the Syrians might wish to redress the balance of power and might attack Israel. The Soviets learned of this course correction and regarded it as an offensive move. In a hotline message from Moscow, Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin said, "If you want war, you're going to get war." Quote, the Soviet Union supported its Arab allies. International trips. Further information. List of international trips made by the President of the United States. Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson made 11 international trips to 20 countries during his presidency. One of the most unusual international trips in presidential history occurred before Christmas in 1967. The president began the trip by going to the memorial service for Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt, who had disappeared in a swimming accident and was presumed drowned. The White House did not reveal in advance to the press that the president would make the first round-the-world presidential trip. The trip was 26,959 miles, completed in only 112.5 hours. Air Force One crossed the equator twice, stopped in Travis Air Force Base, Calif, then Honolulu, Pago Pago, Canberra, Melbourne, Vietnam, Karachi and Rome. 1968 presidential election. As he had served less than 24 months of President Kennedy's term, Johnson was constitutionally permitted to run for a second full term in the 1968 presidential election under the provisions of the 22nd Amendment. Initially, no prominent Democratic candidate was prepared to run against a sitting president of the Democratic Party. Only Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota challenged Johnson as an anti-war candidate in the New Hampshire primary. hoping to pressure the Democrats to oppose the Vietnam War. On March 12, McCarthy won 42% of the primary vote to Johnson's 49%, an amazingly strong showing for such a challenger. 4 days later, Sen. Robert F. Kennedy of New York entered the race. Internal polling by Johnson's campaign in Wisconsin, the next state to hold a primary election, showed the president trailing badly. Johnson did not leave the White House to campaign. By this time Johnson had lost control of the Democratic Party, which was splitting into 4 factions, each of which generally disliked the other 3. The first consisted of Johnson and Humphrey, labor unions, and local party bosses, led by Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley. The second group consisted of students and intellectuals who were vociferously against the war and rallied behind McCarthy. The third group were Catholics, Hispanics and African Americans, who rallied behind Robert Kennedy. The fourth group were traditionally segregationist white Southerners, who rallied behind George C. Wallace and the American Independent Party. Vietnam was one of many issues that splintered the party, and Johnson could see no way to win the war. In addition, although it was not made public at the time, Johnson became more worried about his failing health and was concerned that he might not live through another 4-year term. In 1967, he secretly commissioned an actuarial study that predicted he would die at 64. Historians have debated the factors that led to Johnson's surprise decision. Schessel says Johnson wanted out of the White House but also wanted vindication. When the indicators turned negative, he decided to leave. After Robert Kennedy's assassination, Johnson rallied the party bosses and unions to give Humphrey the nomination at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Personal correspondences between the president and some in the Republican Party suggested Johnson tacitly supported Nelson Rockefeller's campaign. He reportedly said that if Rockefeller became the Republican nominee, he would not campaign against him, and would not campaign for Humphrey. In what was termed the October surprise, Johnson announced to the nation on October 31, 1968, that he had ordered a complete cessation of all air, naval and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam, effective November 1, should the Hanoi government be willing to negotiate, inciting progress with the Paris peace talks. In the end, Democrats did not fully unite behind Humphrey, enabling Republican candidate Richard Nixon to win the election. Administration and Cabinet. Judicial appointments. With the appointment of Thurgood Marshall, Johnson placed the first African American on the Supreme Court. Supreme Court. Johnson in 1965 anticipated court challenges to his legislative measures, and thought it advantageous to have a mole in the Supreme Court who he thought could provide him with inside information, as he was able to get from the legislative branch. Abe Fortas in particular was the individual that Johnson thought could fill the bill. The opportunity arose when an opening occurred for ambassador to the UN. With Adlai Stevenson's death, Associate Justice Arthur Goldberg accepted Johnson's offer to transfer to the position. Only Johnson's insistence, as well as a sleight of hand in Fortas's assuming Goldberg's seat, could overcome Fortas's wife's objection that it was too early in his career. Mrs. Fortas expressed unparalleled disapproval to Johnson personally afterwards. When Earl Warren announced his retirement in 1968, Johnson nominated Fortas to succeed him as Chief Justice of the United States, and nominated Homer Thornberry to succeed Fortas as Associate Justice. However, Fortas's nomination was filibustered by senators, and neither nominee was voted upon by the full Senate. Other courts. In addition to his Supreme Court appointments, Johnson appointed 40 judges to the United States Courts of Appeals, and 126 judges to the United States District Courts. Johnson also had a small number of judicial appointment controversies. with one appellate and 3 district court nominees not being confirmed by the United States Senate before Johnson's presidency ended. Surveillance of Martin Luther King. Johnson continued the FBI's wiretapping of Martin Luther King Jr. that had been previously authorized by the Kennedy administration under Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Pardons. During his presidency, Johnson issued 1187 pardons and commutations. Personality and public image. Johnson, the son of the tenant farmer. Johnson, the great compromiser. Johnson, the all-knowing. Johnson, the humble. Johnson, the warrior. Johnson, the dove. Johnson, the romantic. Johnson, the hard-headed pragmatist. Johnson, the preserver of traditions. Johnson, the crusader for social justice. Johnson, the magnanimous. Johnson, the vindictive. Johnson, the uncouth. LBJ, the hick. Lyndon, the satyr. And Johnson, the usurper. The Big Daddy. The Southerner, Westerner, Texan. The American dreamer. The politician. The father's son. The rising star. The flawed giant. The Periclean paradox. Domestic dreams undone by war. The very human. The tragedy. The pathbreaker. The ascender. And the master. Johnson was often seen as a wildly ambitious, tireless, and imposing figure who was ruthlessly effective at getting legislation passed. He worked 18 to 20-hour days without break and was apparently absent of any leisure activities. There was no more powerful majority leader in American history. Biographer Robert Dallek writes, Dallek stated that Johnson had biographies on all the senators, knew what their ambitions, hopes, and tastes were, and used it to his advantage in securing votes. Another Johnson biographer noted, he could get up every day and learn what their fears, their desires, their wishes, their wants were, and he could then manipulate, dominate, persuade and cajole them. At 6 feet 3.5 inches tall, Johnson's cowboy hat and boots reflected his Texas roots and genuine love of the rural hill country. From 250 acres of land that he was given by an aunt in 1951, he created a 700-acre working ranch with 400 head of registered Hereford cattle. The National Park Service keeps a herd of Hereford cattle descended from Johnson's registered herd, and maintains the ranch property. Biographer Randall Woods argues that social gospel themes Johnson learned from childhood allowed him to transform social problems into moral problems. This helps explain his longtime commitment to social justice, as exemplified by the Great Society and his commitment to racial equality. The social gospel explicitly inspired his foreign policy approach to a sort of Christian internationalism and nation-building. For example, in a 1966 speech he quoted at length from the Social Creed of the Methodist Church issued in 1940, adding, "It would be very hard for me to write a more perfect description of the American ideal." Quote. Post-presidency. After leaving the presidency in January 1969, Johnson went home to his ranch in Stonewall, Texas, accompanied by former aide and speechwriter Harry J. Middleton, who would draft Johnson's first book, The Choices We Face, and work with him on his memoirs entitled The Vantage Point, Perspectives of the Presidency 1963-1969, published in 1971. Johnson gave Nixon high grades in foreign policy, but worried that his successor was being pressured into removing U.S. forces too quickly from South Vietnam, before the South Vietnamese were really able to defend themselves. If the South falls to the Communists, we can have a serious backlash here at home, he warned. During the 1972 presidential election, Johnson endorsed Democratic presidential nominee George S. McGovern, a senator from South Dakota. Although McGovern had long opposed Johnson's foreign and defense policies, the McGovern nomination and presidential platform dismayed him. Nixon could be defeated if only the Democrats don't go too far left. He had insisted. Johnson had felt Edmund Muskie would be more likely to defeat Nixon. However, he declined an invitation to try to stop McGovern receiving the nomination, as he felt his unpopularity within the Democratic Party was such that anything he said was more likely to help McGovern. Johnson's protege John Connally had served as President Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury and then stepped down to head Democrats for Nixon, a group funded by Republicans. It was the first time that Connally and Johnson were on opposite sides of a general election campaign. In March 1970, Johnson suffered an attack of angina and was taken to Brooke Army General Hospital on Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. He was urged to lose a considerable amount of weight. Johnson had grown dangerously heavier since leaving the White House, gaining more than 25 pounds and weighing around 235 pounds. He had also resumed smoking after nearly 15 years without having done so, which contributed further to his health problems. The following summer, again gripped by chest pains, he embarked on a crash-water diet, shedding about 15 pounds in less than a month. In April 1972, Johnson fell victim to a second heart attack while visiting his daughter, Linda, in Charlottesville, Virginia. "I'm hurting real bad," he confided to friends. The chest pains hit him nearly every afternoon, a series of sharp, jolting pains that left him scared and breathless. A portable oxygen tank stood next to his bed, and he periodically interrupted what he was doing to lie down and don the mask to gulp air. He continued to smoke heavily, and, although placed on a low-calorie, low-cholesterol diet, kept to it only in fits and starts. Meanwhile, he began experiencing severe abdominal pains. Doctors diagnosed this problem through X-rays as diverticulosis, pouches of tissue forming on the intestine. His condition rapidly worsened and surgery was recommended, so Johnson flew to Houston to consult with heart specialist Michael DeBakey. DeBakey discovered that even though two of the former president's coronary arteries were critically damaged, the overall condition of his heart was so poor that even attempting a bypass surgery would likely result in fatal complications. Death and funeral. On Inauguration Day, Johnson saw Nixon sworn in, then got on the plane to fly back to Texas. When the front door of the plane closed, Johnson pulled out a cigarette. His first cigarette he had smoked since his heart attack in 1955. One of his daughters pulled it out of his mouth and said, "Daddy, what are you doing? You're going to kill yourself." Quote, he took it back and said, "I've now raised you girls. I've now been president. Now it's my time." From that point on, he went into a very self-destructive spiral. With his heart condition now diagnosed as terminal, Johnson returned home to his ranch. At approximately 3:39 p.m. Central Time on January 22, 1973, Johnson placed a call to the ranch's Secret Service compound complaining of massive chest pains. The agents rushed to the former president's bedroom, finding him unresponsive with the phone receiver still in his hand. Johnson was airlifted in one of his own airplanes to San Antonio and taken to Brooke Army General, where he was pronounced dead on arrival at the facility by cardiologist and Army Colonel George McGranahan. He was age 64. Shortly after Johnson's death, his press secretary Tom Johnson, no relation, telephoned Walter Cronkite at CBS. Cronkite was live on the air with the CBS Evening News at the time, and a report on Vietnam was cut abruptly while Cronkite was still on the line, so he could break the news. Johnson's death came 2 days after Richard Nixon's second inauguration and left the United States with no living former presidents, Harry S. Truman having died weeks earlier on December 26, 1972. Johnson was honored with a state funeral in which Texas Congressman J. Pickle and former Secretary of State Dean Rusk eulogized him at the Capitol. Johnson was buried in his family cemetery, which, although it is part of the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park in Stonewall, Texas, is still privately owned by the Johnson family, who have requested that the public not enter the cemetery. A few yards from the house in which he was born, eulogies were given by John Connolly and the Rev. Billy Graham, the minister who officiated the burial rites. The state funeral, the last for a president until Ronald Reagan's in 2004, was part of an unexpectedly busy week in Washington, as the military district of Washington, Meadow, dealt with their second major task in less than a week, beginning with Nixon's second inauguration. Legacy. History has viewed Johnson both through the lens of his historic legislative achievements and his lack of success in the Vietnam War. His overall rating among historians has remained relatively steady over the past 35 years, and his average ranking is higher than any of the 8 presidents that followed him. Although similar to Reagan and Clinton, the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston was renamed the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in 1973. It is known as Lyndon Baines Johnson Day. The Lyndon Baines Johnson Memorial Grove on the Potomac was dedicated on September 27, 1974. The Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs was named in his honor, as is the Lyndon B. Johnson National Grassland. Lyndon B. Johnson High School in Austin is named after him. Lyndon B. Johnson Middle School in Melbourne, Florida, is his namesake. LBJ Elementary in Jackson, Kentucky is named for him. Interstate 635 in Dallas, Texas is named the Lyndon B. Johnson Freeway. Lyndon Baines Johnson Tropical Medical Center is named after the 36th president who visited American Samoa on October 18, 1966. This marked the beginning of construction of the hospital located in the village of Faigaʻalu, American Samoa. The facility was completed in 1968. A small village run by Felda in Negri Sembilan has been named Felda L. B. Johnson to commemorate his visit to Malaysia in 1966. On March 23, 2007, President George W. Bush signed legislation naming the United States Department of Education headquarters after President Johnson. Major legislation signed. Significant regulatory changes.